most enthusiastic followers. The story is unusual in that Naaman is not a Jew. He was, in fact, an enemy of the Jews. He was a general in the Syrian army. Syria was and is indeed, even today, still at war with Israel. And what is more, Naaman, we're told, was one of their most successful generals. In verse 1, we read that he was a great man and is highly regarded. He was also very rich. He could raise a lot of money very quickly. The gold alone mentioned in verse 5 is valued at £100,000 at today's prices. In other words, he had in his petty cash something like £100,000, so he's a very rich man. Naaman had everything he could possibly wish for, and therefore he had little interest in God. In fact, he had no need of God because he saw himself as a self-made man. And as they say of self-made men, they always end up worshipping their creator. Now, things couldn't have been better for Naaman. And then one day he discovered a white blotch on his skin. From then on, the bottom dropped out of his life, because from then on, he was a leper. The success and the riches meant nothing to him now, because he knew that the prognosis was grave. There was no cure for leprosy, and as a consequence, he was destined to a painful and repugnant death. I wish at this point I could say that he turned to God for help, but he didn't. However, we can see from what is written here that he was certainly fearful and desperate. Try for a moment to picture the absurdity of what we're told here. In verses 2 and 3, we're told that a young captured servant girl, probably in her early teens, comes to his wife and mentions in the vaguest possible terms that there might be a prophet in Samaria who could help Naaman and cure him of his leprosy. There's no record here of this girl actually meeting Elisha or knowing Elisha. It actually doesn't give the impression that she even knows the name of the prophet. She just talks about a prophet in Samaria. There's no indication that Naaman spoke directly to the girl. But on the strength of this second or third hand information, Naaman goes to the king and asks permission to travel south to meet and search for this great prophet. This is a measure of how desperate he was for a cure. Now, all of us know people like Naaman. People who, whilst their lives are busy and fulfilled, appear to be full of self-confidence. However, they haven't got the depth of character to deal with the crises which inevitably will come up into their lives. For example, the final episode that convinced me to leave industry and enter the Baptist ministry was an experience I had at a funeral of a colleague. The person concerned was relatively young and he died suddenly at work. Now, all the top people from my company attended his funeral, and these were people I admired and I wanted to be like that. They were leaders in industry. It included the company president, who at that time was the highest paid executive in Europe. In the boardroom, they were confident and they were articulate. However, in this situation, they looked completely out of their depth. Indeed, they were. They could hardly utter a word to each other, and their body language showed that they were uncomfortable with this situation, and they couldn't wait to get away. Now, there's a story in the Bible told by Jesus of a man who built his house upon the sand. Inevitably, the storm came and the house collapsed. And there are many people, particularly those of my generation, who built the structure of their lives upon a foundation of sand. Now, in the next 10 years, quite a lot of these structures will start to fall down about them as they're exposed to ill health or the death of a partner. Many will have nowhere and no one to turn to. They're confident in themselves. They're confident in life. But when the bottom falls out of their life, they become desperate. Now, quite often, Naaman is presented as a man of faith. He was no such thing. Faith is about trusting someone in whom you have a relationship. Naaman had no such relationship with God. He could therefore not have been a man of faith. He was so out of his depth, he took cash with him, silver and gold, in order to placate and bargain with God. Now, it's a very primitive view of God, which is still prevalent today. Indeed, many church people, I wouldn't call them Christians, have a very primitive and similar view of God. For example, a lady I knew who used to attend a church where I was pastor was very irregular in her church attendance. Then all of a sudden, she started to come to church every week. In my enthusiasm and pride and a little bit of arrogance, I thought it was because she wanted to hear me preach. And I thought the Lord was at work in her life. I couldn't have been more mistaken. Eventually, I found out the reason why she started to come along to church, and which caused this dramatic change in her behavior. She was in her 40s, and she was pregnant. And a doctor had warned her that she might lose the baby at any time, and so she made a bargain with God. She would come along to church if God would deliver her safely of this baby. And she didn't, in fact, lose the baby, and when the baby was safely delivered, she went right back to her old pattern of church attendance. Now, the reason being, she was using her church attendance as a way of bargaining with God, of earning God's favor. It's a very primitive view of God, which is prevalent among many people today. So often when we face a crisis in our life, our instinctive reaction is to bargain with God. Now, we're, of course, not so unrefined as to bargain with silver or gold. We tend to use promises of commitment, which we subsequently fail to deliver on. Now, Naaman also represents those people who are articulate but lack spiritual depth. They may be desperate, but their pride remains unbroken. In verses 6 and 7, he starts to look for the prophet. Where does he start to look? He looks in the king's palace. Now, this, of course, could be evidence of diplomatic courtesy. However, subsequent events show us that although this man is desperate, he still hadn't lost his pride. He wasn't about to lower himself to search for the prophet. He would get the king of Israel to summon the prophet to come to the palace. You see, pride is often the last thing to go when we face a crisis. Indeed, quite often people become more proud and more stubborn when they become more desperately ill. This is because our self-esteem is all we have left. You see, as you get older, it seems to remind us that life is drawing to its natural close all around us. For example, I was recently filling in a form, and those forms were obviously designed by someone in their 20s and 30s, because in the section which deals with your age, you had to tick a certain box. You had to tick 15 to 24, 25 to 34, 35 to 44, 45 to 55, and 55 plus. And I realized I was in the last box. And it was assumed that after that you drop off the end. You would therefore think that as people get older, as we get older, we would start to think more seriously about eternity and our relationship to God and our commitment. But so often we don't. It's all a matter of pride. I don't know whether you've thought about it, the statistics. And I don't want to scare you, but listen to this. If you are 50, you have a 10% chance of not making it to 60. If you're 60, there's a 25% chance that you won't make it to 70. And if you're 70, there's a 95% chance that you won't make it to 80. And if you're 80, well done for being here this morning. Now, these are quite sobering statistics, especially if you're over 50. Now, would you get on a plane if there was a 10% chance of it crashing? Or a 25% chance? Or a 95% chance? None of us would. And yet, you would think that as we get older, you'd think we would be more open to God and the things of eternity. But what you do is you find the opposite. You find that pride gets in the way of us turning to God. A large proportion of the people queuing for a lottery ticket on Friday night or Saturday night won't even be old enough, won't even live long enough to spend the money. And yet, they're seeking to buy a lottery ticket in order to win. A large proportion of the people of us are just, you would think that we'd be thinking more about eternity, but a large proportion of us are so proud about the way that we've been living our lives, that we don't think about eternity until it's too late. Now, let's look how God deals with Naaman. First of all, the prophet sends for Naaman. Now, this is an important illustration of how God deals with people. Most people, if they think about God at all, want to be the one who's in control. For example, we may feel that we can pick and choose the moment when we come to Christ, when we respond to God. We may reason to ourselves that we will commit our lives to Christ, or we'll become a more committed disciple when we've done all the things that we want to do. However, quite often the opportunity does not come again. Alternatively, we may reason that we'll follow the Lord, but we'll follow him on our terms. For example, I had in mind that I was going to go into the Baptist ministry after I'd made a lot of money, was financially secure, paid off my mortgage. But God had other ideas. On Easter Monday in 1987, God spoke to me in such a powerful and vivid terms that he made it clear that I needed to respond then, or else he would not speak to me again on this subject, and there would be no other opportunity. And the point is this: Naaman could have searched for the rest of his remaining days for Elisha, and he wouldn't have found him. Elisha took the initiative and sent for him. And the Bible says to us, seek the Lord whilst he may be found. If God is speaking to you, it may be the best opportunity you will ever have to respond to him. Now, the second way that God deals with Naaman is that he confronts his pride. Remember, Naaman was a very important person, and Elisha was a prophet of God. Now, the prophet was not in the same class as a general in the Syrian army. Remember the words of Jesus to the Jews: which of the prophets have you not rejected? In other words, the prophet was the lowest of the low. In religious society, you had the priests up there and then the prophets down there. However, Elisha not only doesn't come to Naaman, he sends his servant with a message. Go wash 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored to you, and you will be cleansed. It was a calculated insult, and Naaman saw it for what it was. And we read that he was angry. Now, I can't leave this story without pointing out the parallels to believers' baptism. I remember once taking a friend to a service of believers' baptism where God was at work. It was a massive, big service with lots of young people there and lots of young people being baptized. And I wanted my friend to become a Christian, and I was so praying that he would speak to my friend. And at the end of the service, and I said, What did you think, David? And he said in his Scottish brogue, which I won't repeat, he says, it was so humiliating. I hadn't seen a baptism like that. But from his point of view, these people were humiliating themselves. And there's a real sense in which believers' baptism is calculated to humiliate us and to deal with our pride. Baptism, of course, doesn't guarantee that we're a better disciple of Christ, but it is important. And that's why Jesus taught his disciples that they needed to be baptized. Now, many face the challenge of baptism, have the same sort of reaction as Naaman. Aren't there alternatives which I can do? And he answered the question, yes, there are. There is, of course, the alternative of finding a church which doesn't emphasize believers' baptism. Or is there's an alternative of living on the margins of a Christian community, drifting from one Christian group to the never quite belonging, never quite committing oneself. Now, the main effect of baptism is that it deals with our pride. Because if it's not dealt with at the beginning, it will most certainly hinder our future walk with the Lord. And every time the Lord speaks to us and we refuse to do what he asks of us, our heart becomes a little harder. Now, Naaman nearly went home at this point, but for the wise counsel of one of his servants, who said, if the prophet had asked you to do some great thing, you would have done it. How much more when he tells you, wash and be cleansed? In fact, what the servant was saying to Naaman was, washing in the Jordan is not the big issue. The big issue is your pride. Now, I don't want to trivialize some of the great issues of the faith, but quite often they're not big issues. For some of you here this morning, becoming a Christian is not a big issue. It won't mean a change in lifestyle. Most of you are regular church and you live decent lives. You see, being converted to Christ is not the issue. It's our pride that is the issue. We have to admit that we got it wrong for all these years. Baptism is not a big issue. Time and time again, after people have been baptized, they come and they say to me, I don't know why I waited for so long. It was so easy and it was such a blessing. Again, baptism is not the issue. It's our pride. But if we don't deal with our pride, then we will never be able to follow the Lord wholeheartedly. Now, this particular story has a happy ending. Naaman overcomes his pride, and the prophet asks, he asks the prophet to become a follower of Israel's God. Now, I want to finish this morning by dealing with the story of Elisha's servant Gehazi, very briefly. Elisha refuses a payment for the healing because he doesn't want Naaman to lose his sense of indebtedness to God. He's not indebted to Elisha or the prophet. He's indebted to God. Now, Gehazi was undermining everything that Elisha was trying to teach Naaman. And again, there's an important lesson here. We must never lose our indebtedness, our sense of indebtedness to God. As the old hymn says, nothing in my hand I bring, simply to thy cross I cling. It's very easy after time to forget our indebtedness to God and to think we can earn God's favor by doing things for him. Consequently, after a while, our love for the Lord grows a little cold. and the Christian life becomes a burden. And we see God as a hard taskmaster. Now, the story of Naaman is a story of a man who moved from self-reliance and pride to reliance upon God. As such, it's a story which is relevant to each and every one of us, whether we're someone who has yet to become a Christian or someone who's been following the Lord and looking for the next step in our spiritual journey. Now, in a moment, we're going to pray together, and I'm particularly concerned for those of us who have not come to Christ yet. It's not that you're bad people. It's not that God is going to change your life radically. You're not going to change what you do on a Sunday morning or how you behave Monday through to Saturday. But it will change your heart. It will change your heart. Now, some of you haven't become a Christian because it's your pride that's stopping you. You don't want to admit that you've not become a Christian yet. I remember there was someone in the church where I grew up, and she was called Ma Burns. She was so old, and she was leader of the Women's Home, which was a big women's work in the church and everything. She was one of the leaders of the women in the church. Then suddenly she said to us all, "I became a Christian last week." Now, we've thought she'd been a Christian for 50 to 100 years, but she hadn't. And she came to Christ at an old age. She had to admit that she hadn't become a Christian. And sometimes we can go along and Christianity can be a sort of lifestyle choice, whereas it's a relationship with the Lord. And I want to speak to those of you who need to come to Christ this morning. And in quietness, hear the words of Naaman's servant. If the prophet had asked you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? See, the issue is not conversion. The issue is our pride. Let us pray. It may be that God has been speaking to you